One thing I found myself doing on a couple occasions is falling into routines or patterns of the way you do something. And this comes from, maybe you have a set of projects where they're all kind of the same thing. This really applies to people who specialize in one thing, like a wedding photographer, right? Weddings, for the most part, are very similar, so you can kind of build a routine or a pattern, a repetition of how you do things and how you shoot weddings. And so you do wedding A, and then you do wedding B, and you do wedding C, and you do them all the same. And it's very helpful in terms of efficiency because you don't have to worry about going to wedding F and then all of a sudden having to like change everything just because you want to. But other times, what can happen is you can be doing the same kinds of things. Maybe it's a bunch of interviews, or it's a bunch of headshots, or it's a bunch of, I don't know, maybe you're doing music videos, right? And you fall into this pattern of how you do it. And then all of a sudden, another project comes along that's a little bit different. And what happens is you might start defaulting to some of those old other patterns that don't apply to that project. I'll give you an example from something specific that happened to me. There was a time where we were doing a lot of interviews back to back to back to back. And for whatever reason, during this time period, all these interviews were on location in locations that weren't particularly suited for filming interviews. And what I mean by that is they were smaller spaces. And so I had to use a wider angle lens. And the lens specifically was a Sigma 18 to 35. And on the GH4, which is what I was shooting with, that can be, it's not really a wide, with I guess with the speed booster it's kind of wide, but it's more like wide medium. So it's not, fisheye or anything like that. It's super wide where it's unflattering. It works for the interviews. But what I found was I was using the Sigma 18 to 35 for all these interviews, and then we got on location for another interview and we had a lot more space to work with. But I immediately defaulted to grabbing that lens, putting it on the camera, setting it up, ready to shoot the interview with that setup because that's how I'd been doing it. And I'm looking at it, I'm like, I don't like how this looks. This doesn't look good. And what I ended up doing was switching to a 50, I believe. It was the case in that setting because I had the room, I had the depth in the room to make the 50 millimeter work, which on the previous shoots I didn't have. But if I hadn't been paying attention to what I was doing, because sometimes you get in those routines because it's habit, because it's efficient. If you're not paying attention to that, you could end up doing something or making a mistake because it worked on something else, but it wasn't appropriate for that project. So it's just a little bit of like a cautionary thing of, even though it's easy to do things similarly or have a style or whatever it might be that's like your way of shooting or your way of doing something, you still always need to be cognizant and aware that on a particular project, you kind of have to come at it with fresh eyes. Because the last thing you want to do is repeat something that wasn't appropriate for that project and come away with it with footage or with audio or whatever it is, and it's just not right. And someone's going, what the heck were you thinking? Why'd you do that? And what are you going to say? You're like, well, that's what I'd been doing on everything else. I think this applies too to people who look at the way other people do something, someone who's learning, someone who's trying something for the first time, and they're looking at what someone else did. Oh, well, that's how they did it, so I should do it the same way. They did this technique, so that applies to my project, when a lot of times it doesn't. You see it all the time, people who follow an online tutorial for like a motion graphics project or whatever, and they do the tutorial exactly how the tutorial was done, rather than taking those skills and those techniques and applying them to something different and using them in their own unique way based on the underlying foundational principles. They're just mimicking or doing what someone else did. So don't do that. I guess is what I'm saying. Keep in mind the project and what you need for that project, trying to come at it with fresh eyes and treating everything like don't treat it like it's the first time, but kind of in a way, it's kind of like treating everything as like it's the first time you've done it. How should you set this up? How should you make it look? How should you light it? How should you shoot it? Whatever that might mean. Every project's going to be different. So there's not a one answer of like, oh, you need to do this. Every time you're filming an interview, use the Sigma 18 to 35. Don't do that. That's bad advice. It depends on the room size. It depends on the type of interview it is. There's a lot of things to consider. So when you're going into new projects, always keep those fresh eyes.